Jesus' teaching was light. It wasn't a heavy thing to carry, because he was able to put a spin on his interpretation of Torah.
Well, going on to 17, come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men. And it's linked to 18, and straightway, that's a word that Mark uses a lot, and straight away, they forsook or put down their nets and followed him. This is talking about obedience, isn't it? Because they're giving up their potential livelihood. I don't know if they owned the boats, or they would have had a collective, or they had a rich patron or father, whatever. Because when we get to Simon and Andrew with Zebedee, it's plainly obvious that would have been a large boat, as I'll talk about in a moment why. But I'm assuming, because it's not mentioned here, did they own their own boats, giving up that walking away? That's a big thing to do.
Huge thing to do. Massive thing to do. Don't underestimate the sacrifice that these guys did for stepping into following this itinerant rabbi. But the thing is, you've got to understand the Jewishness of this, right? To understand the impact that this would have had. Follow me was the call that all young Jewish men wanted to hear from a rabbi. They all wanted to have a rabbi say, follow me. Because what it did is it lifted them from the family business and it placed them in the line up to follow behind a Jewish teacher, a rabbinical teacher. I think I've said this to you before, that the way that a rabbi chose their disciples was to go into the school of the Talmudim, the school of disciples, and they would then ask them questions about God, and it would be the questions that they asked, it wasn't the answers that they gave. But to get into these schools, they would also have had to be able to recite the first 5 books of the Tanakh from memory, to have been able to recall that without error. This is some incredible academic feat of memory, let alone anything else. And so these guys that were fishing couldn't do that. These would have been the people like me who would have gone, oh, if only I was smart enough, if only I was clever enough, then I might have been chosen too, to follow that rabbi. And Jesus comes along and says, follow me. He's putting out a rabbinical call. That to them wasn't just about packing up their business. That was about stepping into the yoke and the teaching of the rabbi. When you talked about verse 18, it says, and they followed him. Well, following him is all about discipleship, which means they learn from Jesus, but the Talmudim, the disciples of a rabbi, would literally, quite literally, walk in the footsteps of their rabbi. Some rabbis would actually have a rope that they would loop around. So not only did they walk at exactly the same cadence, but if the rabbi had a limp, all of the disciples would walk with a limp as well. So that they followed exactly like their rabbi. And the highest place of honor was to be directly behind the rabbi, so that the dust of the rabbi would cover you. It was a word of blessing. May you be covered by the dust of your rabbi. Which means may you walk so closely behind your teacher, may you walk so closely in his footsteps that everything that he lifts up off the ground comes back and covers you. Everything that he teaches covers you. You are covered by the dust of your rabbi. And so this was a huge honor. Yes, they ditched their family businesses that they would have all been involved in, because these would have been family businesses. Simon Peter, we know, was married, so he walked away from the security of an income coming into his missus. I bet that was an interesting conversation that he had. But the honor was so great because they were being called to follow a rabbi, which for a Jewish man would have been something quite remarkable.
You've mentioned it twice now, and I'd like to bring this up. I wrote down, whither the women. We need to remind ourselves that women were always in attendance. They've not been really written about, and that's understandable because of the time and the period, and as far as Mark's concerned, it's not important. but they are going to have an important role. And I just like to put that across. It's often, I get this sense missed quite a lot. I don't know if it's deliberate or it's just an oversight, but women are an important aspect of this whole unfolding of the preaching of Jesus and beyond.
Absolutely staggeringly so, in fact, to the point of they should never have been written into the story if it wasn't true, because of the way they're written into the story. Because nobody in their right mind would ever, back in that day, use a woman's testimony for anything. And yet the writers of the Gospels, they use women's testimony when a woman's testimony wasn't allowed in court because it was worthless in the culture. And so they're using stuff which was radical. The high regard and the high view of women in Christianity, forget about institutional Christianity. Let's talk about Christianity, that Jesus, the followers of Jesus, it was massive. There were no female disciples of rabbis back in the day. That was not the way it worked. So the fact that Jesus had women who followed him, women who sat at his feet and were taught by him, women who became his apostolos, his sent ones, like Mary of Magdalene, was sent to go and tell the other disciples, was staggering and unheard of. The fact that women are not mentioned specifically at this point, well, that should come as no surprise, because culturally they wouldn't have been. What should come as a surprise is the amount of times they do crop up, because nobody in their right mind, if they wanted this account to be believed, would include them, which also speaks to me of the integrity of it.
It does, and also to the importance of what is being said, because they're not trying to make it look good or gloss it by the times. They're saying, well, a woman was the first to see the empty tomb or whatever. We'll get to that as we come to the end.
Next year, probably.
This would have been for some time the only account. And of course, what's not being talked about is Jesus as a child. And the fact that when he calls the first apostles and they follow him, that he knew the Tanakh so well. I mean, there's the account of him as the child going to the temple, and his parents have no idea where he is. It's at Passover and they have to go back. That would have been a long journey back and forth. Where is he? Well, did you not realise I'd been in my father's house, and so on. He knew the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the scriptures in depth. And they knew this. They would have known this or have come to know it, and they would have followed him gladly. But you mentioned a word about the rabbi calling, and that's yoke. And I remember listening to one of your sermons where you lay out that yokes can be heavy or they can be light. And Jesus' yoke was different, and it would have come across different, especially to those who hearing it, how radical he was.
The yoke, most people know what a yoke is because they see it when you yoke oxen together and they work together and they pull heavy loads and all the rest of it. And so instantly when Jesus talks about his yoke being easy and his burden is light, then people will normally conjure up that picture. But the yoke of the rabbi was the teaching. It was another word for being the teaching of the rabbi. So Jesus' teaching was light. In the Jewish way of looking at things, in the rabbinical teaching, you'd have light and heavy. And so Jesus' teaching was light. It wasn't a heavy thing to carry, because he was able to put a spin on his interpretation of Torah. You see, if you followed a rabbi, you had to follow the teachings of that rabbi. And when that rabbi died, you still followed the teachings of that rabbi. So if you were in the school of Shammai, you followed Shammai. If you were in the school of Hillel, you followed Hillel. And you could not deviate from their teaching. But Jesus didn't sit in either of those two main rabbinical schools. He agreed with Hillel on the majority of things, with the exception of one thing, where he agreed with the school of Shammai on, but he didn't agree with them both all the time. And so Jesus was what they called a rabbi with authority. You'll hear in the scriptures that the scribes and the Pharisees will come up to Jesus and they'll say, "By what authority do you do this?" And that's a rabbinical phraseology. Who gave you the authority to step outside of the teaching of the rabbi that you learned under? we know that Jesus is written out of the account between the age of 12 when he was at the temple, as you've discussed, to the age of around about 30 when he comes back onto the scene. And between the age of 12 and the age of 30, a young Jewish boy, if they were smart enough and were selected, they would go to rabbinical school for training. And then when they get out at 30, that's when they kick off their ministry. So Jesus has gone somewhere and has been trained. We're not told that. We don't need to know that, because whatever and whoever he was trained by, he stepped out from under them and gave his own specific twist. Now, the only people that could do that was a rabbi who had smika, a rabbi with authority. And Jesus was a rabbi with authority. He had smika, and so he could put his own little twist on the interpretation of Scripture, which means, as he said, my yoke is easy, my teaching is easy, my burden is light, because I can give it this little twist, because I am a rabbi with authority. And to become a rabbi with authority, you had to be attested to by 2 witnesses. And Jesus was attested to by 2 witnesses. He was attested to by John, who saw him when he was baptized, and he was attested to by God, who said, "This is my beloved Son." And he does his whole twist on everything and the way that he's going to present things, which is why everything he does is slightly off the rail and a little bit woo and a little bit wah by comparison to the institution, because he's going, yeah, it says this, but I say this.
I'm assuming there would have been, because of the spirit of the age, there'd have been quite a few people like Jesus. We know this, in fact, there are other named Jesuses. There certainly would have been people claiming to be messiahs.
Yeah, of course.
This would have been not unusual,
Yeah.
but of course we're talking about Jesus the Messiah, and he would have had something that would have got people's attention. And it wasn't just knowledge. It would have been his presence. It would have been something about him.
Gosh, yeah, he'd have been so different. He's the man who sat with the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the sinners. He healed the sick. He raised the dead. He gave sight to the blind. He was heavily involved with people. One of the places that he loved to be was Bethany, and Bethany was the leper colony. He loved to be amongst the down and out, the downtrodden, the oppressed. He'd have been like a glorious ray of sunlight in the lives of so many people. And he would have been like a clap of lightning to the institution that he stood opposed to. Because he's saying, you've got all of this head knowledge, but what you're not doing is you're not actually living it out. Jesus was saying, look, I am the Jewish Messiah, but the Jewish institution that's supposed to recognize me and supposed to be a beacon for our God to the nations is actually not doing what it should have done.
We talked about that in our episodes to do with churchianity and Christianity.
Yeah.
I have to remind myself, and I would ask others to remind themselves, the stark divide between the two. Sitting in a church saying you're saved doing the sinner's prayer doesn't make you a Christian.
Nope, it doesn't.
Although when you hear that, if you are one of those people that we've upset you immensely, an atheist telling me I'm not a Christian, get lost.
You talk about women. Jesus says in verse 17, I'll make you fishers of men. But it's actually not men. This is the Greek word anthropos, which is fishers of people.
Yeah.
So it's
mankind.
It's humanity as a collective, which includes men and women. Jesus is setting it out that his view of work is, you're going to have to roll your sleeves up because you're going to be fishermen. It's going to be labour intensive. You're going to work long hours. Sometimes you're not going to catch a thing. So he's setting it out in terms of the JD, the job description of what he's giving these people.
Stormy waters, Steve. Stormy waters.
But you need a good work ethic, you need to be persistent, you need to be dedicated to the task. And when you do catch people, you're going to be snatching them out of the fire.